The king's gardeners, Jarmo Palamaki. The king had a large, lovely garden area. He chose qualified gardeners to take care of it. Because he loved diversity, the gardeners chosen were also very different, both in principles and in their ways of working, and each of them was responsible for his own plot. In the beginning, everything looked good. The flowers and shrubs flourished in a wonderful splendor of color, and the gardens produced a lot of good berries and fruits. However, a lot of weed seeds had been spread by the wind, which easily got into the open ground and began to germinate and grow. Soon the situation had gotten out of hand. No more weeding attempts could overcome the power of the weeds, but they spread efficiently from one garden plot to another, and were soon conquered the entire garden area. Mr. Diligent was one of the chosen gardeners. He was convinced that with enough hard work, everything would get even better. He toiled from early morning until late at night, and he always managed to temporarily clear a corner of the visible weeds. But when he moved to the next corner, the previous one was soon overgrown and looked even worse than before the cleaning. Eventually, his strength and health deteriorated so much that he had to give up. Mr. Superficial thought to himself that it would be enough as long as he could cut the most visible weeds. And so he did. He cut all the ugliest and biggest weeds, but left the lower or best-looking weeds. At first, she made her garden look better than everyone else. From a distance, there were hardly any weeds to be seen, but a closer look would have revealed that the weeds had taken over the lower floors. Gradually, they smothered all the original wonderful plants by taking over the ground with their rhizomes. Eventually, this power of weeds could no longer be hidden. Iotes, Mr. Timid, was a conscientious and diligent caretaker of his garden. But his problem was that a herd of wild boars in the nearby forest made it a habit to eat in his garden plot. They gradually ate all the good fruit and rummaged through the whole garden upside down until all the lovely flowers and shrubs were destroyed. Mr. Timid did not dare to drive them away, but on the contrary, whenever a herd of wild boars came into the garden, he ran away and locked himself inside his house. It was only when there were nothing but the most thorny thistles growing in the garden that the wild boars left him alone, but came every now and then to check if something better to eat had already been planted in the garden. Mr. Unlucky's garden plot has taken many heavy blows. At first, there was drought and heat, killing most of the flowers. Then the garden was hit by heavy rain and flooding, which drowned out the rest of the flowers. After this, a hurricane uprooted all the good bushes and filled the garden with weed seeds. So it was no wonder that after these, his garden looked even worse than everyone else's. In the garden of Mr. Faithful, the weeds had taken over as well. In desperation, he sent word to the king that he was in dire need of help because he would never be able to overcome the wild plants that plagued the garden alone. The king promised to provide the necessary assistance. First, the garden was hit by a heat wave that dried up and killed all the smaller weeds, the ones whose roots did not reach deep enough. Then came rain and flooding, which softened the hard soil that had dried up due to the heat. Then the storm tore off all the remaining, larger weeds, and finally the wild boar herd went to turn over the entire soil in the garden, lifting up all the remaining roots of the weeds. Mr. Faithful was at first terrified of such help, but then decided that the king would know what would be best. He decided to use his time and energy to protect the few remaining flowers and shrubs, watering them during droughts and building shelters over them against storms and wildlife. Whenever the trials that befell the garden tore off or brought to the surface the roots of weeds, he carefully collected and burned them so that they could no longer spread. Eventually, the soil in the garden of Mr. Faithful was soft, moist, and weed-free, and it was easy to plant seeds and seedlings sent by the king. It didn't take long for the garden to start blooming, as it did in the beginning. True, the weeds were constantly trying to gain a foothold there, but when Mr. Faithful uprooted them as soon as they appeared, they could no longer gain power. Years later, the king came to inspect his garden area. He was terrified of the plots where the weeds were prevalent and ordered them to be destroyed so that the weeds would not spread into the environment. Instead, he was pleased to see the garden of Mr. Faithful and decided to give it to him forever.